Imagine this. You're on a dream vacation with your family, toes in the sand, the ocean breeze in your hair. When suddenly, police cars screech to a stop. Officers jump out with guns drawn and slam you in handcuffs right in front of your children. You've done nothing wrong, but they've already decided you're guilty. What these cops didn't know? The man they just arrested is an FBI agent, and they're about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. You're finally on that long-awaited sunny beach vacation with your family. The warm sand is under your feet. The sound of waves fills the air, and your kids are laughing as they build sand castles. Life feels perfect. You've worked hard for this break, and for once there's no work stress. No phone calls, no deadlines, just peace. But in the blink of an eye, that peace is shattered. Out of nowhere, a screech of tires cuts through the ocean breeze. A black and white police cruiser slams to a stop just a few feet away. Before you can even process what's happening, two strangers in uniform are rushing toward you, hands on their guns, faces set with hostility. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them," one barks. Confusion hits you like a wave. You're holding your daughter's hand. Your wife is helping your son dry off after swimming. How could you possibly be a threat? But the officers aren't listening. Within seconds, they're shoving you face first against your own car, forcing your arms behind your back. The cold metal of handcuffs bites into your wrists. Your wife is shouting, "What's going on?" But the answer she gets is nothing but a sharp, "Ma'am, step back." The kids are crying now, their voices breaking. "Daddy, Daddy." People nearby stop what they're doing. Beachgoers, tourists, and locals alike are pulling out their phones, recording this surreal scene. You're aware of the stares, the whispers, the cameras, but none of that matters right now. What matters is that your family is scared, and you're being accused of something you didn't do. One of the officers leans close and growls, "Don't play dumb!" You match the description. Description? Of who? Of what? You try to speak, your voice steady but firm. "Officer, there's been a mistake. Please check my ID." But your words fall on deaf ears. You can see it in their eyes. They've already decided who you are and what you've done. And it's not based on evidence. It's based on something else entirely. That warm Saturday afternoon in Clearwater, Florida was supposed to be the Johnson family's dream vacation. Instead, it was about to become the day two. Officers made the biggest mistake of their careers. David Johnson had been looking forward to this trip for months. His wife, Monica, had planned every detail, from the beachfront hotel to the seafood restaurants. She'd read glowing reviews about online. Their children, Ethan and Layla, could barely contain their excitement, counting down the days, until they could run barefoot on the sand and splash in the warm Florida waves. Life in Washington, D.C. was fast-paced and demanding. David, a tall, composed man in his early 40s, spent most of his days and nights at work. His neighbors saw him as a quiet, polite family man who mowed his lawn on Sundays and waved hello on his way to the car. Even his kids just thought of him as Dad, the man who grilled burgers in the backyard and helped with school projects when he wasn't too tired from work. But there was another side to David's life, one most people would never guess. Behind the easy smile and calm demeanor was a career that demanded nerves of steel. David was a special agent with the FBI, a role he'd held for nearly 2 decades. His work had taken him into dangerous neighborhoods, across state lines and even overseas. He'd tracked down arms dealers, infiltrated organized crime rings, and dismantled trafficking networks. In the Bureau, David's reputation was solid. He was the man you called when a case seemed impossible. His reports were precise, his instincts sharp, and his moral compass unwavering. Co-workers admired his ability to remain level-headed even in the most high-pressure situations, a skill that had saved lives more than once. But David didn't bring his work home. Monica knew bits and pieces of his cases, but never the full stories. The children knew even less. This vacation was supposed to be a rare time when Agent Johnson could disappear, and Dad could take his place completely. For David, Clearwater, Florida was not just a getaway. It was a promise to his family that, for 1 week, they could have his undivided attention. No calls, no briefings, no danger. Just the sound of waves, the feel of sand between their toes, and memories they could cherish for years. At least, that was the plan. While the Johnsons enjoyed the golden afternoon sun, laughing and splashing in the waves. Trouble was quietly brewing just a few blocks inland. The sound of crashing, surf and children's laughter on the beach was a world away from the tents. Scene unfolding outside a small, corner convenience store. Inside, moments earlier, two men had been lurking in the electronics aisle. Both were in their mid-20s, white, wearing baseball caps pulled low over their eyes. They moved with purpose, grabbing phone chargers, earbuds, and small Bluetooth speakers, slipping them into oversized hoodies. The store's aging security camera caught everything, but the clerk, a young man working alone, had little time to react. When he stepped out from behind the counter and called out, "Hey, you need to pay for those!" The thieves bolted. The bell above the door jingled violently as they pushed it open, nearly knocking over a customer coming in. The pair sprinted into the parking lot, heading straight for a vehicle waiting with the engine running, a black SUV. The clerk rushed to the door, fumbling with his phone as he tried to get a better look. He barely caught the plate number before the SUV sped off, tires squealing against the pavement. Heart pounding, he dialed 911. "Yeah, I just got robbed." Two white guys, 20s, took electronics. They left in a black SUV. I think it headed toward the pier. The dispatcher pressed for details: height, clothing, facial features. But the clerk was still shaken. "I don't know, man. They had hats on. Just black SUV, maybe older model." It wasn't much to go on. But to the officers responding, that vague description would become a dangerous assumption. In their minds, the suspects were now whoever happened to be in a black SUV near the pier. No careful verification, no double-checking with the victim, just a mental target. And as fate would have it, not far from that pier, another black SUV sat parked with its trunk open, while a family packed up their beach towels, sunscreen, and sand toys, completely unaware that the next few minutes were about to turn their perfect vacation into a nightmare. Minutes later, the Johnsons left the beach, still laughing about Ethan's attempt to build the world's tallest sandcastle before the tide claimed it. Monica carried the beach bag, heavy with wet towels and sunscreen, while David walked ahead with the keys in hand, leading the way toward their rental, a sleek black SUV they'd picked up at the airport just 2 days earlier. The pier was alive with activity. Street performers juggled, tourists snapped selfies, and fishermen cast their lines into the water. It was the kind of picture-perfect evening people came to Florida for. David spotted their SUV and pressed the unlock button. The familiar chirp of the car alarm disarming made Layla skip ahead, eager to claim her seat by the window. He opened the door, smiling as the salty breeze ruffled his shirt. It was one of those rare moments of complete contentment, the kind you don't realize you'll miss until it's gone. Then came the sound. A deafening screech of tires against asphalt cut through the chatter of the pier. David turned, instinctively pulling his kids closer. A black and white police cruiser had swerved into the narrow lane behind their SUV, stopping so abruptly the front bumper nearly kissed the rear of their rental. Before anyone could ask what was happening, the driver's door flew open. A stocky officer in dark sunglasses stepped out, hand already gripping the butt of his holstered weapon. The passenger door followed, and a taller, younger officer emerged, his own hand hovering over his sidearm. Both moved fast, their boots pounding against the pavement. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them," the older officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. David froze for a fraction of a second, his mind processing the scene like a crime in progress. He'd been on the other side of these situations, countless times, but never as the target. Ethan and Layla looked up at him, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Monica instinctively pulled them to her side, shielding them from the advancing officers. David raised his hand slowly, the keys dangling between his fingers. His voice was calm but firm. "Officers, is there a problem?" Neither one answered his question. Their focus was locked on him, as if they'd already decided he was guilty. David kept his hands raised, his voice steady despite the confusion swirling inside him. "Officer, what's going on?" he asked, enunciating each word carefully. It was the kind of calm, measured tone he had used countless times in the FBI to de-escalate volatile situations. But instead of answering, the older cop took a slow step forward, his jaw tightening. A faint smirk, almost a sneer, crept across his face. "Don't play games," he said coldly. "You match the description." The words hit David harder than the sun beating down on the pier. Description of what? Who? He hadn't even been told what crime had supposedly taken place. Before he could respond, the younger officer, standing slightly behind his partner, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Figures." It was a single word, but it carried the weight of years of prejudice. David had heard that tone before, in interrogation rooms, in hostile towns, in places where skin color was all it took for someone to be labeled suspicious. But never had it been directed at him in front of his children. David's FBI instincts kicked in instantly. He read the scene like a trained agent. 2 officers, one dominant and aggressive, the other quieter but just as complicit. No backup yet, meaning they'd acted fast. And most importantly, no actual explanation for their actions. This wasn't a carefully handled police stop. It was a rush to judgment. He shifted slightly, angling his body to keep his kids in his peripheral vision. Monica's arm was wrapped protectively around Ethan and Layla, her face a mix of shock and outrage. "Officers," David said, keeping his tone even, "I'm with my family on vacation. I think you've got the wrong—" "Quiet," the older cop snapped, cutting him off. "We'll handle this our way." The younger one smirked faintly, like the outcome was already decided. And in that moment, David knew this wasn't about mistaken identity alone. This was about power, about control, and about the dangerous assumptions these 2 men had made the second they saw a black man standing next to a black SUV. What they didn't know, yet, was that they had just chosen the wrong man to target. It all happened so fast, David barely had time to process it. The older officer closed the distance in 3 long strides, spinning David around and yanking his arms behind his back. The cold bite of steel snapped shut around his wrists, tighter than necessary, and the familiar click of the handcuffs echoed, like a gavel slamming in a silent courtroom. "Hey, what are you doing?" Monica's voice cracked as she stepped forward, clutching the beach bag against her side. "Ma'am, step back and stop talking," the younger cop ordered sharply, holding one hand out toward her as if she were a threat. Monica froze, torn between protecting her children and defending her husband. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, eyes darting between the officers and David. By now, the lively hum of the pier had shifted. Passers-by slowed their steps, heads turning toward the commotion. A man with a fishing pole stood frozen mid-cast, watching intently. A group of teens pulled out their phones, recording from different angles. The soft hiss of waves against the shore was now drowned out by the clicks and beeps of video apps going live. Ethan clung to Monica's leg, his small face scrunched in confusion. "Mommy, why is Daddy in trouble?" "He didn't do anything!" Layla's voice trembled as tears spilled down her cheeks. David's stomach tightened. He'd faced dangerous men before, armed suspects, gang leaders, fugitives. But nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as seeing fear in his children's eyes. He turned his head toward the officers, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I can explain everything if you check my ID." The older cop didn't answer. Instead, he gripped David's arm and gave it a slight shove toward the cruiser. "Please," David continued, his tone unwavering despite the heat of anger rising in his chest. "You'll see I'm not who you think I am." Still, there was no acknowledgement, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant murmur of the gathering crowd. David knew then that this wasn't about facts. It wasn't about proof. It was about perception. And the officers had already decided the story they wanted to believe. The younger officer finally noticed David's wallet lying on the ground near Monica's feet. For a fleeting moment, David thought logic might win out. That maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end right there. But instead of opening it, the cop stooped down, gave it the briefest glance, and casually tossed it aside as if it were a piece of litter. "We'll sort it out at the station," he said flatly, his tone carrying the finality of a decision already made. David's jaw tightened. In his years with the FBI, he'd seen what could happen when officers acted first and verified facts later, and it rarely ended well for the person in custody. If they took him in without confirming his identity, he'd be booked into the system as an unknown suspect. Once that happened, it could take hours, maybe longer, to correct the record. Hours in which Monica would be left alone with the kids in an unfamiliar city. Hours where his name could be publicly tied to a crime he hadn't committed. And hours where a misunderstanding, born of prejudice, could escalate into something even worse. But David also knew the danger of pushing back too soon. With his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his wife and children just a few feet away, and two armed officers already on edge. The wrong move could set off a chain reaction he couldn't control, so he forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his shoulders relaxed even though every muscle screamed in protest. His mind shifted into the quiet. Analytical mode he'd relied on countless times during undercover operations. Wait for the right moment. It was the mantra running through his head. He scanned the crowd, noting the growing number of phones pointed in their direction. Good. Witnesses meant accountability. He glanced at Monica, giving her the smallest nod, a silent message. I'm okay. Just stay calm. The younger officer gripped David's arm, starting to guide him toward the cruiser. David went along, his face unreadable, his mind calculating. Somewhere between here and the station, he would have to turn the tables. And when he did, these officers would regret every choice they had made in the last 5 minutes. Just as the younger officer tightened his grip on David's arm, a sharp, determined voice cut through the noise of the crowd. Hey, those aren't the guys you're looking for! Both officers turned their heads slightly, their postures stiffening. A middle-aged woman in a faded blue sundress was striding toward them from the direction of a small cafe on the corner. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she carried a half-finished iced coffee in one hand. I saw the whole thing, she said, her tone firm and unshakable. The shoplifters were white, both of them. One had on a red baseball cap, the other had a beard, and they didn't come anywhere near this pier. They ran toward the marina. She pointed decisively down the opposite street, her voice loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. Several people murmured in agreement, nodding toward her as if they had seen the same thing. David felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone speaking up. Someone who could clear this up in seconds if the officers were willing to listen. But instead of easing their grip or even acknowledging the possibility of a mistake, the younger cop's jaw tightened. Ma'am, please step back, he said, his voice clipped, his eyes avoiding hers. The woman planted her feet, refusing to move. No, I won't step back. You're arresting the wrong person in front of his wife and kids, and the real thieves are getting away right now. Do your job and go after them. Her words rippled through the crowd, triggering a few scattered shouts of agreement. Phones continued recording, the bystanders sensing that this was no ordinary arrest. David watched the exchange carefully, noting how the older officer's eyes flicked toward the street. The woman had pointed to, then back to him, as if weighing which was the bigger threat. Two fleeing criminals or admitting they had made a mistake in public. In that moment, David knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. The kind who would rather double down than admit they were wrong. And that told him something else, too. If he wanted this to end the right way, he would have to force the truth into the open himself. David had reached his limit. He'd tried calm reasoning. He'd allowed them every chance to check his ID, to correct their mistake before it spiraled further. But now, with his children still crying and the crowd watching, he knew it was time to pull back the curtain. He straightened his posture, despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists, and took a slow, measured breath. His voice was low, but carried enough weight for both officers, and half the bystanders to hear. All right, he said evenly. You want the truth? Check the credentials in my inside jacket pocket. The younger officer blinked, momentarily caught off guard. David continued, his tone sharpening. I'm Special Agent David Johnson, FBI, and you just unlawfully detained me and terrorized my family in public. It was like flipping a switch. The younger officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a stiff, uncertain expression. The older one's face went pale, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift in power. Somewhere a phone camera zoomed in, catching every detail. Finally, the older officer stepped forward, reaching hesitantly into David's inside jacket pocket. His fingers closed around the leather case. He opened it, and there it was. The golden FBI badge caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon. The laminated credentials, crisp and official, left no room for doubt. The older officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes darted to his partner, silently screaming, "We messed up!" The younger one took a half step back, his hand falling away from his holstered weapon. Around them, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Words like FBI and "Oh, they're done" floated through the air. A few people chuckled under their breath, already predicting the fallout this scene would cause once the videos hit the internet. David held their gaze, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, his voice steady but carrying a razor's edge, "you're going to think very carefully about your next move." For the first time since they'd arrived, it wasn't the officers who had control of the situation. It was David, and they knew it. The moment the badge caught the light, the energy shifted. The older officer cleared his throat. His earlier command voice replaced with something softer, almost shaky. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding." But David wasn't about to let him rewrite the story. He took a single step forward. His eyes locked on the man's. His tone was calm, but every word landed like a hammer. "A misunderstanding?" He repeated slowly. "You pointed guns at my children." The officer's gaze flickered toward Ethan and Layla, who were still huddled against Monica's side. Ethan's tear-streaked face and Layla's trembling. Hands told a truth that no excuse could erase. David didn't stop. "You ignored my identification. You had my wallet in your hands and tossed it aside. You racially profiled us based on nothing more than the color of our skin and the type of car we drive." The younger cop shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his belt. The older one's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, pressing in just enough to hear every word. Several people were holding up their phones, recording from different angles. Some had gone completely silent, while others began murmuring, short, sharp phrases like, "That's not okay," and "He's right." A woman's voice from somewhere in the group cut through the tension. "We saw everything. You two need to answer for this." The younger cop's eyes darted toward the growing semicircle of onlookers. He could feel the heat of judgment in their stares, the silent verdict forming before anything official had been said. David held his ground, his presence filling the space between him and the officers. "You've violated my rights. You've traumatized my children, and you've wasted valuable time that could have been spent catching the real criminals. So don't stand here and tell me it's a misunderstanding." His voice was low, but it carried, every syllable crisp, enough to be caught on the dozens of recording devices now pointed at the scene. For the first time since their arrival, the officers looked small. And judging by the buzz in the crowd, this misunderstanding was about to become a viral lesson in what happens when prejudice collides with the wrong target. David didn't need to shout. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried a kind of authority the officers couldn't ignore. "You're going to call your chief," he said, each word precise, "right now." The younger officer glanced at his partner as if waiting for a signal, but the older one had already pulled out his radio. His hands, so steady before, now moved with a nervous stiffness. The crowd murmured, sensing that something big was about to happen. Static crackled from the radio as the call went out. The older cop kept his back to David while speaking, as though that might somehow lessen the humiliation. Within minutes, a black unmarked SUV rolled into the pier's narrow lane. Out stepped the police chief, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly pressed uniform and an expression that said he already knew exactly how bad this looked. His eyes swept the scene, the crowd, the phones, Monica's protective stance over the kids, and David standing tall in handcuffs. It took less than 2 seconds for him to close the distance. "Get those cuffs off him," the chief ordered sharply. The older officer fumbled for the key, unlocking the metal restraints with a quiet click. David flexed his wrists slightly, feeling the sting where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. "I'm Chief Reynolds," the man said, his voice measured but firm. "Agent Johnson, I want to personally apologize to you and your family. This never should have happened." Monica gave a short, disbelieving laugh, still holding Layla close. Ethan peeked from behind her, his eyes still red from crying. David met the chief's gaze. "Apology noted," he said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "But we're not done here." The chief straightened, clearly bracing for what was coming. Around them, the crowd shifted, holding their phones higher. Every second of this was being documented. David took a breath. "Your officers not only acted without proper cause, they escalated a situation based on racial bias and ignored clear evidence that they had the wrong people. I expect a full documented response, and I will be reporting this incident to the Department of Justice." The chief nodded slowly. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. "I'll be filing a full report with the Department of Justice," David said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of final judgment. The police chief's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what those words meant. Weeks, maybe months of scrutiny, paperwork, and media heat. And worse, the very real possibility that the two officers standing there would lose their badges. "Understood," the chief replied, nodding slowly. His tone was respectful now, almost deferential, a sharp contrast to the arrogance David had faced only minutes before. From the edge of the crowd, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, a single pair of hands, breaking the tense silence. But then others joined in. Soon, a ripple of applause moved through the onlookers, mixed with murmurs of "good for him" and "about time." David didn't bask in it. He wasn't here for praise. He turned to Monica, who still had her arm protectively around Layla, and gave her a reassuring nod. "Let's go home," he said softly. He crouched down to Ethan and Layla's level. "You did nothing wrong," he told them. His voice warmed despite the lingering tension. "Remember that. And remember, the truth always matters." Monica squeezed his hand, and together they walked toward their black SUV. The crowd made way for them, some patting David on the shoulder as he passed. The officers stood rigid, their faces pale, as the family climbed into the vehicle. David paused before starting the engine. He looked in the rearview mirror, catching the eyes of the younger officer. There was no anger in his expression, just a steady, unshakable certainty. It was the look of a man who had fought bigger battles than this, and won. As they pulled away from the pier, the Florida sun still shone brightly overhead, but the day's joy had been stripped away. The Johnsons had come for a peaceful beach vacation. Instead, they'd been reminded that prejudice could find you anywhere, even in paradise. But there was one comfort in it all. The message had been sent loud and clear. No one is above the law. No one should be targeted because of the color of their skin. And for the two officers left standing in silence, that lesson might be the one thing they'd never forget. Later that evening, as the Florida sun dipped low on the horizon, David stood outside a modest press area near the beachfront. Word of the incident had already begun spreading online, and a few local reporters had gathered, cameras ready, microphones in hand. He stood tall, his posture calm but resolute. "Whether you're a factory worker, a teacher, or an FBI agent like me," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The reporters leaned in, sensing this was more than just a statement. It was a call to action. "My badge might protect me in situations like this," David continued, glancing toward Monica and the kids, who watched quietly from the SUV. "But what about the people who don't have one? What about the young man walking home from work? The mother picking up groceries? The teenager riding his bike through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time?" He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the small crowd. Even the waves crashing behind them seemed quiet. "We must do better as a society," David said firmly, "because until we do, no family is truly safe. And I don't just mean safe from crime. I mean safe from being judged, targeted, or harmed simply for existing while black." One of the reporters asked if he planned to pursue charges. David didn't hesitate. "I'll be filing my report. But this isn't just about punishment, it's about change. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and that should scare all of us." With that, he offered a polite nod to the press and walked back to the SUV. He opened the driver's side door, but before getting in, he glanced back at the pier where it had all unfolded. The crowd from earlier had mostly dispersed, but the memory of dozens of witnesses, phones raised, eyes wide, lingered in his mind. Then, without another word, he slid behind the wheel and drove away, leaving behind 2 humiliated officers, a handful of reporters, and a story that would soon circle the internet. A story carrying one unshakable truth: prejudice has no place in law enforcement. If you believe no family should ever face discrimination, share this story so more people hear it. And if you want more true stories like this one, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next.